Today, we're going to talk about the dramatic story of a colossal collapse, the great unraveling of the Mughal Empire.
It's a question that echoes through history, right? How does an empire that's known for its incredible wealth and power, one that dominated a whole subcontinent for centuries, just fall apart? Well, today, we're going to piece that puzzle together.
And what's so wild about this story is just how fast it all happened. Seriously, we're not talking about a slow, centuries-long decline. The Mughal unraveling was a rapid, often violent collapse that pretty much took place in just over 50 years.
All right, so where did it all start to go wrong? Let's take a look at the very first cracks that started to appear in that imperial facade.
Okay, so our story here is framed by two really critical dates. It all kicks off in 1707, with the death of the powerful but pretty controversial Emperor Aurangzeb. And it kind of culminates around 1761 with a huge decisive battle. This little window of time, just about 50 years, is where everything just completely falls apart.
And this right here, this is really the root of the problem. As the source material puts it, Emperor Aurangzeb had basically emptied the treasury and worn out the army by fighting this long, draining war in a region called the Deccan. He left his successors with an empire that looked magnificent on the outside, but was pretty much hollowed out.
So, with the empire's bank account and army basically running on fumes, the stage was set for some serious internal chaos. Which brings us right to our next section, a house divided.
You see, after Aurangzeb died, the center just couldn't hold. That really sophisticated imperial machine that had been running the empire for generations, it just started to break down. His successors simply didn't have the juice, the authority to keep all their powerful nobles in line.
And this is a perfect breakdown of how the whole thing was picked apart from the inside out. Ambitious governors out in the provinces had a simple three-step playbook. Step 1. You get control of the money, the revenue offices known as the Diwani. Step 2. You take over the local military administration, the Faujdari. And the final move, the checkmate, you just stop sending tax money to the capital. And just like that, you go from governor to pretty much an independent ruler.
And it wasn't just the governors causing trouble. Oh no, the pressure was building from everywhere. You had peasants and local landowners in open rebellion because taxes were just crushing them. You had powerful chieftains just carving out their own little kingdoms. And all the while, the emperors back in the capital were basically powerless to stop this massive bleeding of money and authority.
Now you can probably guess what happens next. An empire that's this weak on the inside, well, it starts to look like a pretty juicy target for outsiders. And that takes us to the next devastating chapter, invasion from abroad.
And two guys in particular came in and delivered some absolutely devastating blows. First up, you've got Nadir Shah from Iran. In 1739, he marches right into Delhi and just plunders the city. Then, he's followed by the Afghan ruler Ahmad Shah Abdali, who launched raid after brutal raid into North India. He came back 5 times between 1748 and 1761.
And we're not talking about a small raid here. The damage was catastrophic. When Nadir Shah packed up and left Delhi, he took with him what the source calls immense amounts of wealth. This wasn't just a robbery, it was basically a massive heart attack for an empire that was already incredibly sick. So you've got rebellions from the inside, invasions from the outside. What was actually left of the Mughal Empire? Well, that brings us to our final section, the Empire of Ashes.
You would think, right, that the nobles back in the capital would be like, okay guys, we need to pull together. But nope, they did the exact opposite. The court was completely paralyzed because two powerful groups of nobles, the Iranis and the Tehranis, were just fighting each other. They weren't trying to save the empire, they were fighting over who got to pick over its corpse.
And this is where things get truly humiliating for the emperors themselves. They became totally irrelevant. According to the source, they were nothing more than puppets. They had the title, they had the crown, but all the real power was in the hands of these warring noble factions.
And if you want proof of just how powerless they were, just look at this list. I mean, it's pretty chilling. Being the emperor became the most dangerous job in the land. 2 of them were straight up assassinated by their own nobles. 2 others were blinded. This wasn't a royal court, it was a viper pit.
So, that's where we end up. The Mughal Empire was basically a ghost. It still existed on paper, sure, but in reality, all the real power, all the money had shifted away from the emperor to all these other regional players. It was a hollow shell. Now, when a massive power like this collapses, it leaves a huge vacuum.
And as the Mughals faded into history, another power, the British, was quietly getting stronger and stronger over on the coasts. So the big question this whole collapse leaves us with is, who's going to rise up from these ashes to take control of it all?
You know, we often have this image of great empires falling in some single dramatic collapse. But what if that's not how it really happens? Today, we're going to dive into how one of the world's great superpowers, the Mughal Empire, didn't just end, it fractured, creating a whole new map of power. This is the story of the empire's heirs. So it really begs the question, right? How does a massive empire actually fall apart? Is it one big dramatic event? A single lost battle? Or is it something slower, more complex? Well, for the Mughals, the answer wasn't a sudden collapse at all, but a really fascinating process of transformation. And to really understand that transformation, we have to start right at the center. The foundation for all this change was, well, a pretty simple fact. The heart of the empire was weakening. By the 18th century, the emperor back in Delhi was seriously losing his grip. And this wasn't just some minor issue, oh no. This was a massive power vacuum opening up at the very heart of a vast political system. And as we all know, a vacuum never stays empty for long. So who filled that vacuum? Two key groups, the subadars and the zamindars. So subadars, think of them as governors of these huge provinces. They were the emperor's top regional administrators, controlling both the army and the finances. And then you had the zamindars. These guys were powerful local landowners who were in charge of collecting taxes. So as the emperor's authority started to fade, both of these groups saw their chance and started consolidating power for themselves. Now, this consolidation of power wasn't random at all. It actually happened in a few pretty distinct ways, following three main paths that would ultimately redraw the entire map of the subcontinent. Okay, so these three paths were pretty different. First, you had governors of the old Mughal provinces who essentially just became independent rulers. Second, some states that were already kind of semi-independent, we call them vassals, made their break official. And third, you had armed rebel groups that seized their independence through fighting. Now, while they're all super important, we're going to focus on that first group because it tells this absolutely fascinating story of how insiders took over the whole system from within. So let's take a closer look at those insiders. The most powerful states that came next were the ones carved directly out of the old Mughal provinces. These were the heavyweights, the direct heirs to all of that Mughal authority. Three regions in particular really stand out: Awadh, Bengal, and Hyderabad. And listen, these weren't some forgotten territories out on the fringe. They were the economic powerhouses of the entire empire. And here's the most critical detail of all. The founders of these new independent states, they weren't outsiders. They weren't foreign invaders. They were the ultimate insiders. We're talking members of the highest ranks of the Mughal nobility. Just take a look at the founders: Saadat Khan in Awadh, Murshid Quli Khan in Bengal, and Asaf Jah in Hyderabad. Their Zat ranks, which was the measure of their status and military responsibility, were 6,000 and 7,000. To be crystal clear, this was the absolute top tier of the imperial system. You just couldn't get any higher. And that's the great irony, isn't it? These incredibly high ranks, they weren't just fancy titles. They meant that the Mughal emperors had placed enormous trust and confidence in these men. They were supposed to be the pillars of the empire, who then went on to become the independent rulers of its most valuable pieces. Let's just focus on that number for a second. 7,000. In the Mughal system, a Zat rank of 7,000 was the absolute pinnacle of the nobility. It gave a person command over vast armies and enormous financial resources. So when men like Asaf Jah and Murshid Quli Khan took control of their provinces, they weren't starting from scratch. They already had the power of kings. So what's the big takeaway from all of this? Why does this particular moment in history matter so much? The crucial point is this. The end of the Mughal Empire wasn't a sudden collapse where everything just disappeared. It was a transformation. The power didn't vanish into thin air. It was redistributed from a single central authority to a network of powerful regional rulers, many of whom were the empire's own elite. The map of India was literally redrawn. Which leaves us with a final thought to consider. Looking at how the emperor's most trusted governors became the new kings, you have to ask yourself, is power ever truly destroyed, or does it simply change hands, finding new forms and new masters?
So what happens when a massive empire just falls apart? Who gets to build something new from the rubble? Well, today we're digging into the story of a man who did just that. This is the story of the founder of Hyderabad, the incredible Asaf Jah.
Okay, so let's set the scene. It's the early 18th century, and the mighty Mughal Empire, which had ruled the Indian subcontinent for hundreds of years, is starting to seriously unravel. You've got chaos, you've got intense competition, and you've got a huge power vacuum just waiting to be filled.
You know, it's one of those classic questions in history, right? When the old order collapses, who steps up? Well, in this story, the answer is one of the empire's own top officials.
All right, let's dive into this man's absolutely incredible rise, from being a key player in the emperor's court to becoming a king in everything but name.
So this is the man of the hour, Nizam-ul-Mulk Asaf Jah. He starts out as one of the most powerful nobles in the Mughal court, a big shot under Emperor Farrukhsiyar, but, his ambitions were way, way bigger than just staying in the capital.
And this slide, wow, it really lays out his whole game plan perfectly. You can just see the calculated climb. He starts as a powerful noble, gets himself appointed governor of Awadh, and then gets the keys to the much bigger, much messier Deccan region. Every single step was a strategic move, getting him closer and closer to ruling his own kingdom.
So he gets down to the Deccan provinces, and this place is just bubbling with chaos. But for a guy like him, chaos, well, that's opportunity. Let's see how he turned it into the foundation of a new state.
Now, here's what's so genius about his strategy. He didn't lead some big, flashy rebellion. No. Instead, he used his official job as the Mughal governor to slowly and carefully build up his own power. He basically used the shell of the old dying system to create a brand new one from the inside out.
I mean, the guy was a total master strategist. He brought in skilled soldiers and administrators from northern India who were loyal to him, not to some distant emperor in Delhi. He appointed his own officials called mansabdars and gave them jagirs, land grants, to secure their loyalty. He was building a whole new power structure that answered only to him.
And this, right here, is the real kicker. On paper, Asaf Jah was still just a servant of the Mughal emperor. But in reality, he was running the show, completely on his own. The emperor back in Delhi couldn't do a thing about it, except just approve whatever decisions Asaf Jah had already made. What a power move. But look, you don't just build a brand new kingdom without making a few powerful enemies. Holding on to his new prize was going to be a constant fight. It was inevitable, really. His success basically painted a giant target on his back. He was in a constant struggle against other major players in the region who all wanted a piece of the pie.
First up, he had this huge threat breathing down his neck from the west, the Marathas. These guys were a serious military force, and Asaf Jah was pretty much always at war with them, just trying to defend his borders.
And it wasn't just outside threats. Right in his own backyard, he had to deal with these independent Telugu warrior chiefs, the Nayakas. These were powerful local leaders who were not exactly thrilled about a new guy coming in and telling them what to do.
And then, as if that wasn't enough, over on the East Coast, his plans for expansion ran smack into a new, fast-growing power, the British. Asaf Jah had his eye on the super-rich textile areas of the Coromandel coast, but the British were getting stronger and stronger there, and they blocked him at every turn.
So with all these challenges coming at him from every direction, you'd think he'd be in trouble, right? Nope. Asaf Jah didn't just survive, he absolutely thrived. Let's take a look at the incredible legacy he built. Just listen to this. This description comes from 1790. That's more than 40 years after he died. It gives you this stunning picture of the lasting wealth and power he established. This wasn't some minor regional state. This was a major league force. I mean, just stop and think about that number for a second. 400 elephants. Just in his personal guard. That one little detail tells you everything you need to know about the sheer scale of his power and the incredible court he created.
So here's the bottom line. Asaf Jah wasn't just a smart politician or a good general. He was a founder. He built a dynasty, the Nizams of Hyderabad, that would last for over 200 years, right up into the middle of the 20th century. And that really brings us to the big question, doesn't it? The story of Asaf Jah shows us that to build something lasting from the wreckage of the past, you need ambition, you need strategic genius, and maybe most of all, you need the brilliant insight to use the authority of a dying system to create a new one. A powerful reminder of how new powers rise when old ones fall.
Picture this. It's the 18th century. One of the world's great powers, the Mughal Empire, is starting to crumble at the edges. But when an old order starts to fall apart,
It creates these incredible openings for new players to step up. Today, we're going to tell the story of one of those moments, the birth of the state of Awadh. So that's the big question we're tackling. How do you actually do that? It's not as simple as just starting a rebellion. It takes serious strategy, some clever innovation, and, of course, seizing the perfect moment. What we're about to see is basically a masterclass in state building.
Okay, so first things first. Why are we talking about Awadh? What was the big deal? Well, this wasn't just some random province. Awadh was considered one of the absolute jewels in the Mughal crown.
And this is where the real drama is. You've got this incredibly wealthy, productive land, but the central government, the empire that's supposed to be running the show, it's getting weaker by the day. And that creates this massive power vacuum just sitting there, waiting for someone ambitious to come along and fill it.
Let's break down exactly why Awadh was such a prize. For one, it controlled the Ganga Plain. We're talking the breadbasket of the entire region. Super fertile, super important. On top of that, it sat right on the main trade highway between North India and Bengal. So if you controlled Awadh, you control the flow of both food and money. A huge deal.
All right, so into this scene steps our main character. In 1722, a man named Burhan-ul-Mulk Sadath Khan gets appointed as the governor, or subadar, of Awadh. This guy, he is the architect of everything that comes next.
And here's the interesting part. The Mughals didn't just give him one job. Right from the get-go, they handed him not one, not two, but three incredibly powerful positions all at the same time.
And this really shows you the kind of power we're talking about. He held the Sibadari, which made him the political boss. He had the Diwani, giving him control over all the money and taxes, and he also held the Fajdari, putting him in charge of the military and justice. I mean, think about it. He was the CEO, the CFO, and the head of security all rolled into one. That's a ton of power for one person. So with all that power, you'd think his first move would be some big, dramatic declaration of independence, right? Nope, he was way smarter than that. Instead, he started this quiet, methodical process of just slowly and carefully snipping the ties that connected Awadh to the Central Empire.
He had this brilliant four-step playbook. First, he starts reducing the number of Mughal officials in the area. Then he shrinks the lands they control. Step 3, he brings in his own loyal people to fill those empty spots. And look at that fourth step, check in the accounts. That wasn't just about good bookkeeping. It was a power move, sending a clear message. I'm the one in charge of the money now.
And he didn't stop there. He also went in and took direct control of the most productive farmlands from powerful local chiefs. You can see what he's doing, right? Every acre of land, every official he replaces, it's another brick in the foundation of his new independent state.
So he's got the political situation more or less under control. Now he turns to the next, and maybe the most critical piece of the puzzle, the money. Because you can't build a state if you can't pay for it. He needed a reliable source of cash.
I mean, that's the real challenge, isn't it? The old Mughal system was inefficient, and it kept him tied to the very empire he was trying to distance himself from. To be truly independent, he couldn't just change the politicians. He had to completely revolutionize the financial system.
And here is his brilliant solution, a system using revenue farmers, or injardars. So instead of having government officials try to collect taxes, the state would auction off the right to collect taxes to the highest bidder.
This comparison really shows the genius of it. Under the old Mughal way, income was always a gamble. But in this new system, the state gets a guaranteed amount of cash right up front from the winning bidder. All the risk of actually going out and collecting the money, that was now on the contractor, not the state. And just like that, he had a predictable income to build his army and his government. It was a total game changer.
But this financial revolution did a lot more than just fill up the treasury. It actually started to fundamentally change the social fabric of Awadh. It created a whole new class of powerful people.
And this is where the story takes a really interesting twist. Because by creating this whole new market for tax collection, Burhan-ul-Mulk accidentally kickstarted a massive social shift, one he probably never even saw coming.
So who were these new players? Well, think it through. You have the revenue farmers, but they need a lot of cash up front to win the bid. So where do they get it? From moneylenders or mahajans. And who guarantees the whole deal for the state? Local bankers. Suddenly, these financial groups became absolutely essential to the day-to-day operation of the state.
This quote really drives the point home. For the first time ever, you had people whose power came from their wealth, not from an appointment by the emperor. And they were starting to have a real say in how the state was run. This was a radical change from the old Mughal way of doing things. So the key takeaway here is pretty clear. The independence of Awadh wasn't just a political story.
It was really a story about a brilliant financial pivot. This was a new state built on a completely new economic engine, one that was totally separate from the old empire. And this leaves us with a pretty big, thought-provoking question. Burhan-ul-Mulk used this new financial system to build his state and gain independence. But in doing that, he also handed a huge amount of influence to bankers and financiers. And it makes you wonder, at what point does the state stop controlling the money and the money start controlling the state?
Today, we're jumping into a really fascinating moment in Indian history, the story of 18th-century Bengal. You know, this is one of those classic tales of transformation, where the crumbling of a giant empire opens up this huge window of opportunity for new, ambitious leaders to step in.
And that brings us to our big question. How exactly is a new state born from the ashes of an old one? Well, that's precisely what was happening. As the incredible Mughal Empire started to lose its grip, it created this massive power vacuum, and believe me, there were plenty of people across the subcontinent just waiting for a chance to fill it.
You have to remember, for centuries, the Mughals had held these enormous territories together. But by the 18th century, that central power was really starting to fray at the edges. Now, if you were a provincial governor far away from the capital, you didn't see this as a crisis. No, you saw it as a golden opportunity to build up your own power base.
And over in the incredibly rich province of Bengal, the man of the hour was Murshid Quli Khan. Now, technically, he was appointed as just a deputy to the governor, but he wasn't about to stay a deputy for long. He moved fast, seizing all the real power that mattered, especially command over all the money coming in.
But see, this wasn't just some simple power grab. Murshid Quli Khan was way more methodical than that. He was really the architect of a whole new state. He had a very clear strategy to break away from Mughal control and build an administration that was loyal only to him. Let's take a look at his playbook. What's so amazing here is just how deliberate he was. So step one, as we saw, he grabs all the powers of the governor. Then, and this was a brilliant move, he literally transfers all the Mughal landholders, the Jagidars, right out of Bengal and ships them over to neighboring Orissa to cut off their influence. Step three, he orders a complete reassessment of all of Bengal's revenues. And finally, and this is the absolute game changer, step four, he demands that all revenue, every last bit of it, be collected strictly and only in cash. That last step, it was going to change everything. And boy, did it change things. These weren't just some boring administrative tweaks. No, these policies kicked off a full-blown economic revolution in Bengal. It created a completely new financial landscape and a brand new class of powerful people. Because, you know, like any huge economic shift, this new, strict, cash-only system created some very clear winners and some very clear losers. The old way of doing things was basically obsolete overnight, and not everyone could keep up. And this slide just lays it out perfectly. On one side, you've got the traditional landowners, the zamindars. Suddenly, they're forced to pay their taxes in hard currency, which many of them just didn't have. So what do? They have to borrow from bankers. And if they can't pay back those loans, well, they have to sell their lands. And who's right there waiting to lend the money and then snap up the land? The new power players, the bankers and moneylenders. Their influence was just exploding. So this super close connection between the state and the financiers, that became the foundation of the new Bengal. This whole trend really hit its peak under the ruler Alivardi Khan around the mid-18th century. And there was one particular banking house that became the symbol of this whole new era of financial power.
And that family was the Jats banking house. The name pops up again and again. They became, as the source material puts it, extremely prosperous. I mean, we're not just talking wealthy. These guys were a central pillar of the state. They were the living proof of the incredible rise of this new financial elite.
Okay, so now let's zoom out for a second and look at the bigger picture. Because the really fascinating thing is, what happened in Bengal wasn't some isolated incident. It was basically a blueprint that was being copied by other rising regional states all across India.
In fact, if you look at it from a bird's-eye view, the story of Bengal really shows us three common features that pretty much all these powerful new states shared.
All right, here they are. First, these new rulers were all really suspicious of the old Mughal way of granting out land revenues, the Jagidari system. Second, they all switched to a different way of collecting taxes. Instead of using their own state officers, they started contracting the job out to revenue farmers. And third, just like we saw in Bengal, they all cozied up to rich bankers and merchants. And this system of contracting out tax collection, it had a name, Ijaradari. What's so interesting is that the Mughals had hated this practice. They thought it was corrupt and unreliable. But for these new regional states, hey, it was a super efficient way to guarantee a steady stream of cash.
So, this is the main takeaway. Bankers and merchants became absolutely essential cogs in the machine of this new political order. Think about it. They would lend money to the tax farmers who needed cash up front to bid on the contracts. In return, the bankers got land as security and collected taxes through their own people, giving them a direct, powerful stake in how the state was run.
All of this leaves us with a pretty big question, one that goes way beyond 18th century India. When an old system collapses, who gets to write the new rules? Well, as the story of Bengal shows us loud and clear, it's very often the people who control the money.
So what happens when a massive empire starts to fall apart? Who steps up to fill the void? Today, we're diving into the 18th century, a time when the mighty Mughal Empire was starting to fade. And right there, ready to make their move, were the Rajput rulers. These guys were absolute masters of strategy, turning their position as vassals, or subordinate rulers, into a launchpad for their own incredible ambitions. All right, let's get into this amazing story of power, politics, and what it means to build a legacy.
Here's how we're going to break it all down. First up, we'll look at the very foundation of their power, their own ancestral lands. Then we'll see how they cleverly pushed their borders outwards. We'll zoom in on the most powerful ruler of the time, check out their incredible forts, and then, believe it or not, we'll look to the stars to see their most lasting achievement.
All right, so how did this all kick off? You might think it started with some big rebellion, but that's not it at all. It actually began from a really unique and privileged position they held inside the Mughal system. To really get this, you have to know this term Watan Jagir. You can kind of think of it like a grand bargain. The Rajput kings gave the Mughal emperors incredible military service, and in return, they got the ultimate prize, the right to rule their own homelands with a ton of freedom. This wasn't just a piece of land, it was a secure power base. And this deal was absolutely crucial. You had rulers from key states, like Amber and Jodhpur, who weren't just subjects, they were powerful partners who had earned a whole lot of autonomy. This gave them a solid foundation, a home turf they could operate from, while the rest of the empire was slowly descending into chaos.
And that brings us right to the heart of it all, ambition. With their homeland secure, these Rajput rulers didn't just sit back and watch the show. No way. They saw a massive opportunity, and they grabbed it with both hands.
Their strategy was just brilliantly simple. I mean, why go pick a fight with the emperor in his far-off capital when there was valuable and now poorly defended territory right next door? The goal was to just expand outward, to absorb the lands that bordered their own kingdoms. And they were aiming high. We're talking about some of the empire's most valuable real estate. You have Raja Ajit Singh of Jodhpur going after the governorship of wealthy Gujarat, and the powerhouse Sawai Raja Jai Singh of Amber making a play for Malwa. These weren't just random land grabs, this was a strategic move to control the economic engines of the whole region.
And it wasn't just about getting appointed as governors either. They took direct military action. The kingdom of Jodhpur, for example, straight up conquered and annexed the neighboring territory of Nagaur. Talk about sending a clear message. Our borders are officially expanding.
And of course, Amber wasn't about to be left out. They jumped in and seized big chunks of their neighbor Bundi. So what you're seeing here is this methodical, coordinated push by these top Rajput states to grow their own kingdoms while the central Mughal authority was looking the other way. It was a total masterclass in political chess.
Now, if there's one person who just perfectly embodies this whole era of Rajput power, it has to be Sawai Raja Jai Singh of Amber. The man was a brilliant military strategist, a hugely powerful governor, and, as we'll see, a true visionary.
I mean, his most famous legacy is the city he built from scratch, his new capital, Jaipur. And it's more than just a city. It's an absolute masterpiece of urban planning. It was a bold statement of power, culture, and permanence. And if you want to understand just how much political muscle he had, just look at this number, 12. 12 years. That's how long he was the governor of Agra. Now, this wasn't some backwater town. Agra was a major imperial city, right near the heart of Mughal power. To hold that job for over a decade, it shows you he was basically indispensable.
The sheer scale of his influence was just staggering. A Persian writer, back in 1732, at the absolute peak of Jai Singh's power, wrote that his control stretched from the imperial capital of Delhi all the way south to the Narmada River. That's a huge swath of the subcontinent.
So how is all this power protected? Well, the answer is built into the landscape.
in these incredible Rajput hill forts. And we'll also look at the story of one state that chose a very, very different path.
You have to understand, these forts were way more than just military bases. They were entire worlds unto themselves. Behind these massive walls, you'd find stunning palaces, temples, busy markets, even incredibly smart water systems with reservoirs and stepwells. They were basically self-sufficient cities on a hill, the ultimate symbols of Rajput power.
But here's the twist. Not all the Rajput states played this game the same way. While Amber and Jodhpur were expertly working within the Mughal system to grow their power, one state always stood apart: Mewar. From the very beginning, Mewar just consistently defied the Mughals. It's such a fascinating contrast in strategies, one side playing the inside game, the other choosing constant resistance.
So, was this Rajput expansion just destined to continue forever? Not quite. There was a new power rising up from the south, the Marathas, and they were a force to be reckoned with. Starting in the 1740s, their armies began campaigning in Rajasthan, and they put so much pressure on these Rajput kingdoms that it basically put a stop to this era of rapid expansion.
But, military victories and political power can be temporary. So what is it that really endures? For our last chapter, we're going back to Sawai Jai Singh, who looked past the battlefields and up to the heavens.
And this is where the story takes such a cool turn. The same guy who was commanding vast armies also had this deep, genuine passion for science, especially astronomy. So he decided to use his immense wealth and power to create something for the sake of pure knowledge.
And what a project it was. He didn't just build one observatory. No, he built a whole network of 5 of them in key cities across northern India. I mean, the scale and ambition of the scientific project was just completely off the charts for its time.
These places, known as Jantar Mantras, are truly something else. They're not buildings that have instruments inside them. The giant stone buildings are the instruments. They're these massive, perfectly engineered structures designed to track the sun, the moon, and the stars with just unbelievable accuracy. It's a legacy written in stone and aligned with the cosmos itself.
Which brings us right to our final thought. The Rajput kings of the 18th century were masters of their time, expanding their lands and power as a great empire faded. But centuries later, it's the stunning architecture of Jaipur and the scientific genius of the Jantar Mantars that still capture our imagination. So it kind of leaves us with a question, doesn't it? When empires crumble and borders change, what truly remains? The lands you conquered or the new ideas you create? All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping into an absolutely incredible story that spans a whole century. It's all about how the Sikh community, born out of conflict, managed to organize and build a massive kingdom right in the heart of the Punjab.
So how did they pull this off? Well, we can break this amazing journey down into 4 key parts. First, we'll look at how this community was literally forged in fire. Then we'll see their first bold move to declare themselves rulers. After that, how they found this incredible strength and unity. And finally, the moment a kingdom is born.
Okay, so let's set the scene. Our story really gets going in the late 17th century. And let me tell you, this was a really chaotic time for the Sikhs. They were constantly clashing with these super powerful Mughal and Rajput rulers who basically ran the region.
So in the middle of all these escalating battles, the 10th Sikh Guru, Guru Gobind Singh, had a realization. He saw that just fighting back wasn't going to cut it. He needed to do something radical, something that would totally transform the Sikh community and get them ready for the long fight ahead.
And that's exactly what he did. In the crucial year of 1699, he created the Khalsa. Think of it as this highly disciplined, totally committed community of soldier saints, all tied together by a shared code and one single purpose. So what was the Khalsa, really?
Yeah, see, the Khalsa wasn't just some army he put together. Oh no, it was a completely revolutionary idea, a new social and political order. It was meant to be the collective will of the people, the living, breathing embodiment of the Guru's authority right here on Earth.
And this right here is the idea that fueled everything. Guru Gobind Singh gave the Khalsa this powerful, unwavering belief: Raj karega Khalsa, the Khalsa shall rule. Now, you got to understand, this wasn't just some catchy slogan. It was a declaration of destiny, a promise that would power their struggle for the next 100 years.
All right, so you have this powerful idea, but how does that turn into actual action on the ground? Well,
Right after Guru Gobind Singh's death in 1708, the Khalsa's belief in its destiny was put to the test immediately. A leader named Banda Bahadur, who was actually appointed by the Guru himself, stepped up. He just completely galvanized the Khalsa, taking all that energy and channeling it into a full-scale, organized rebellion against the ridiculously powerful Mughal Empire.
And here's what's so amazing about this. They weren't just winning battles. The second they had a chance, they started acting like a real sovereign state. I mean, they were striking their own coins, setting up their own government, and carving out their own territory. This was a direct, in-your-face challenge to Mughal rule.
But the Mughal Empire was still an absolute beast. And as incredible as this rebellion was at first, it was eventually crushed. Banda Bahadur was captured in 1715, and a year later, he was executed.
Now, you'd think that would be the end of the story, right? Their leader's gone, their first attempt at a state is completely dismantled. But the idea of the Khalsa and its unique organization turned out to be incredibly tough to kill.
So they regrouped, but this time not under one single leader. Instead, they built this brilliant, decentralized network. It started with small warrior bands called Jathas. These Jathas then grouped together into larger confederacies called mills, and whenever a huge threat appeared, all the mills would unite their forces into one grand army, the Dal Khalsa.
And this is where their system of governance gets really interesting. The entire Dal Khalsa would meet up in Amritsar during big festivals to make collective decisions. These were called Gurmatas, which means resolutions of the Guru. This system made sure everybody was on the same page, all moving together with a single purpose.
With this new structure in place, they also set up this really clever system for administration and protection called Rakhi. Basically, they went to local farmers and villages and offered them protection from everyone, from the Mughals, from foreign invaders, even from local bandits.
And here's the deal they offered. It was a win-win. In exchange for that guaranteed security, the farmers would pay a tax, specifically 20% of their harvest. This simple plan was genius. It did two huge things. One, it built incredible loyalty with the people on the ground. And two, it gave them the money they desperately needed to keep their army going.
So you've got military flexibility, you've got collective decision-making, and a stable way to fund it all. This whole setup allowed the Khalsa to do way more than just survive. It set them up to challenge the biggest powers in the region and finally achieve that destiny they believed in.
And over the next few decades, that's exactly what they did. They systematically fought off what was left of the Mughal governors. They even went toe-to-toe with the fearsome Afghan invader, Ahmad Shah Abdali, and won. They eventually seized total control of the incredibly wealthy province of the Punjab. So by 1765, they were in a position of undeniable strength, and they did it. The Khalsa once again declared their sovereign rule. And you know how they marked the occasion? Just like Banda Bahadur did 50 years earlier, they struck their own coin.
And get this, in a hugely powerful symbol of that multi-generational goal, the inscription on the new coin was exactly the same as the one Banda Bahadur had used. It was like they were shouting across time, saying, "The dream never died. We're back."
There was just one last piece to the puzzle: unification. See, the missile system was great for fighting, but it meant the Punjab was still divided up among different Sikh chiefs. Then, in 1799, one of those rulers, the legendary Maharaja Ranjit Singh, managed to bring all the groups together. He established his capital at Lahore and officially founded the Sikh Empire. So when you look at the story of the Khalsa, you're really seeing a powerful answer to that question. It shows you exactly how communities' absolute, unshakable belief in its own destiny, when you combine that with brilliant organization and just incredible resilience, can forge a sovereign nation against what really seemed like impossible odds. All right, let's get into a heck of a story today. We're talking about how a regional kingdom, born in the hills of the Deccan, grew to challenge one of the most powerful empires on Earth at the time. This is the rise of the Maratha Empire, and trust me, it's a true underdog story, full of strategy, ambition, and just pure defiance. I mean, think about that for a second. How do you defeat an empire when you're up against an enemy that is established, incredibly wealthy, and has a massive army? How do you even start to push back? That's the big question we're going to unpack, because the Maratha didn't just fight back, they pretty much wrote a new playbook on how to do it. So let's set the scene. Picture this. It's the late 17th century in a part of India called the Deccan.
The big power here, the undisputed heavyweight, is the Mughal Empire. But something new is stirring. A new power is starting to bubble up, one that was forged in constant opposition to Mughal rule. And the man at the center of it all? One single figure, Shivaji. Born in 1630, he's the guy who would go on to build a kingdom that didn't just resist the Mughals, but directly challenge their authority.
Now, he wasn't alone in this. From day one, Shivaji had these incredible influences. His mother, Jijabai, gave him the vision, this burning idea of an independent kingdom. And at the same time, his guardian, Dada Khandev, was giving him top-notch military and administrative training. It was this one-two punch that set him on a path of conquest from a super young age. The ambition was there right from the get-go.
So, how to get started? With incredibly smart strategic moves. Taking over Javli was a game-changer early on. See, this wasn't just about grabbing more land. No way. This was about locking down a critical strategic area and, just as important, getting all the local leaders on his side. That one move made him the clear, undisputed boss of the Mabala Highlands, and that became the launchpad for everything that came after. And this quote just nails it. His reputation started to explode. He wasn't just winning small skirmishes, he was taking on the major players in the region, the Sultanate of Bijapur and the Mughals themselves. These incredibly daring moves are what turned him into a living legend, a symbol that resistance was actually possible.
Okay, but becoming a legend takes more than just being brave, right? You need a killer strategy. And this brings us to the real secret sauce of the Marathas' early success, their totally revolutionary way of fighting. They just refused to play by the empire's rules, so they made up their own.
What's so cool about this slide is the contrast. It's just night and day. On one side, you have the Mughals. They fought a very traditional war, big armies, big battles, hiding behind big forts. The Marathas, they did the complete opposite. They just went around the forts. They'd raid cities to mess with the economy, and this is the most brilliant part, they'd hit the Mughal supply lines. They went for the weak spots. It was all about speed, surprise, and chaos.
So who were the soldiers making this all happen? Well, the army was basically built for speed. Its power came from two main groups. You had the powerful warrior families, the Deshmukhs, who were the leaders and the cavalry. Then you had the Kunbis, these super mobile peasant pastoralists who knew the land like the back of their hand. They were the infantry, the backbone. That combination of expert leadership and local knowledge was the perfect engine for this new type of warfare.
Of course, you can't run a war on ambition alone, right? You need cash. A growing kingdom needs a steady income. So, how did the Marathas pay for all this? Well, their administrative and tax system was just as creative as their military strategy.
Okay, so the first pillar of their economy was this tax called chath. And this is just genius. It was a tax of 25% on the land's revenue, and they'd claim it from landowners in territory that was still technically under Mughal control. By collecting this, the Marathas weren't just getting rich. They were actively proving that the Mughals couldn't protect their own subjects, positioning themselves as the new power in town.
Let's just pause on that number. 25%. A full quarter of the revenue. Just think about that for a second. For a brand new kingdom to successfully demand that much money right from under the nose of a massive empire, it just shows you how much influence they were gaining. This was a systematic cash flow that poured right into the Maratha war machine.
And they didn't stop there. On top of the chath, they added another tax called Sardishmukhi. This was an extra 9 to 10% that was paid to the head revenue collector, a title the Maratha ruler claimed for himself. You put these two together, and you've got a seriously powerful economic engine for building a state. Shivaji laid an incredible foundation, but his death wasn't the end of the story. Not even close. The next generation took his kingdom and supercharged it, transforming it into a full-blown empire. Let's look at how they pulled it off.
So after Shivaji's time, the power structure actually changed a bit. The real authority shifted to a family of Chitpavan Brahmanas who held the title of Peshwa, which is like being the principal minister. They became the power behind the throne, serving Shivaji's successors, and they had big plans.
And with new management, you get a new headquarters. Under the Peshwas, the heart of the Maratha kingdom moved to Pune. It became the new administrative capital for their rapidly growing empire. And under the Peshwas, the expansion went into overdrive. Just look at this timeline. Between 1720 and 1761, they were just relentlessly chipping away at the Mughal Empire. In the 1720s, boom, they grabbed Malwa and Gujarat. By the 1730s, the Maratha king was officially recognized as the ruler of the entire Deccan Peninsula. A massive amount of this incredible growth was thanks to one man, Bajirao I. This guy was an absolute military genius. He took the tactics and the ambition of Shivaji's era and just scaled them up, pushing Maratha influence way beyond its traditional borders. Seriously, his career was just a highlight reel of victory after victory. He launched these lightning-fast campaigns and secured huge territories like Malwa, Bundelkhand, and Gujarat. And he didn't just fight other Indian powers. He even took on a European force, the Portuguese, and won. Every single one of these wins was another nail in the coffin of Mughal dominance.
So that brings us right back to where we started. From Shivaji's hit-and-run tactics to Bajirao's massive imperial campaigns, the rise of the Marathas was all about innovative thinking, both on the battlefield and in the treasury. It proves that to challenge a giant, you don't just need more force. You need to change the rules of the game entirely. And it kind of leaves you wondering, doesn't it? What modern empires could be challenged if someone just decided to play by a different set of rules?
All right, let's dive into a really fascinating moment in Indian history. We're talking about the 18th century. The mighty Mughal Empire, which dominated for so long, was starting to fade. And that created this huge power vacuum. And you know what happens when there's a vacuum, right? Someone steps in. In this case, it was two incredible new powers, the Marathas and the Jats. This is their story. I mean, that's the ultimate question, isn't it? When the central authority just crumbles, the entire subcontinent is basically up for grabs. So let's take a look at who had the vision, who had the strategy, and honestly, who had the guts to try and carve out a new future. So picture this. It's 18th century India. You can pretty much forget any map you've seen before this period. A whole new political landscape was being drawn. And not with ink. It was being drawn with ambition and with military power. The old order was collapsing and new states were literally being forged in the fire of conflict and opportunity. Okay, first up, let's talk about our first protagonists, the Marathas. Coming out of their base in western India, they just exploded onto the scene. And they weren't just another regional kingdom, no way. These guys had a continent-spanning vision. Their goal was nothing less than to replace the Mughals as the top power. So let's see how they went about it. Now here's the real catch with the Maratha strategy. On one hand, their military campaigns were just unbelievably successful. I mean, they were raiding everywhere, expanding their influence from Delhi all the way down to the south. But, and this is a big but, this aggressive expansion had a major downside. Their tactics kind of ticked off all the other rulers. So when they really needed allies for the huge showdown at the Third Battle of Panipat in 1761, well, they found themselves pretty much alone. So you might be wondering, how on earth did they manage such a massive area? Well, it was through this super clever tribute system. Instead of all the headaches of trying to directly rule every single place, they basically made other rulers an offer they couldn't refuse. It was like, hey, pay us tribute, accept that we're in charge, and you can keep managing your own local affairs. It was a brilliant model, really, for projecting power and pulling in tons of resources without stretching their own administration too thin. But don't get the wrong idea. The Marathas weren't just about smash and grab. Wherever they set up secure rule, they actually built a pretty effective administration. And the key here is that they were pragmatic. They weren't dogmatic. They adapted their tax collection to whatever worked locally, they encouraged farming, and they got trade booming again. All of this, of course, generated the cash they needed to fund those powerful armies. See, they weren't just conquering, they were building. And you gotta understand, this empire wasn't a one-man show. It was more like a confederacy of these powerful chiefs, or sardars. You can think of them as regional warlords and administrators all rolled into one. Guys like Scindia, Gaikwad, Bonesley, and Holkar, they each managed their own territories and had their own armies. And under their leadership, cities like Ujjain and Indore absolutely flourished, becoming huge, prosperous hubs for trade and culture. And here's a perfect example of how that economic impact actually worked. Let's just follow one product, silk. You've got silk being produced in the Chanderi region. Suddenly, it finds this huge new market in Pune, which was the Maratha capital. That boom then helps a trading city like Burhanpur totally expand its business, connecting Pune and Nagpur with big cities in the east like Lucknow and Allahabad. So the Marathas weren't just redrawing borders, they were creating brand new arteries for commerce. Okay, so while the Marathas are playing this massive continent-wide game of influence, another power, the Jats, they were doing something completely different. Instead of expansion, they were all about building an unbreakable stronghold right in the heart of the old empire. So who exactly were the Jats? Well, they were prosperous farmers. These guys were masters of the land. And their location was everything. They built up their power in that super strategic corridor right between the two imperial capitals, Delhi and Agra. Their whole approach wasn't about far-flung influence. It was about deep, concentrated power that was literally rooted in the soil. And man, did they make an entrance. Under their leader Churaman, they managed to grab control of territories just west of Delhi, and for a while, they basically became the guardians of Agra itself. Just think about that for a second. This new power effectively takes over one of the crown jewels of the Mughal Empire. But the guy who really put them on the map was the legendary Suraj Mal. He's the one who consolidated the Jat state at Bharatpur, turning it into this bastion of security. In fact, here's a little story. When the Persian ruler Nadir Shah completely sacked Delhi in 1739, where do you think the city's rich and famous fled for safety? Not to another Mughal city. They ran to the Jat kingdom. That tells you everything you need to know about where the real power and security was at that point. So after Suraj Mal, his son Jawahir Shah decided it was time to go big, to challenge the Mughals directly. And to do that, you need an army, right? He put together a truly massive one. He started with his own core force of 30,000 Jat troops. But he was smart. He knew that alone wasn't going to cut it. So, in a really savvy move, he hired an extra 20,000 seasoned Maratha mercenaries to fight with him. And just to top it all off, he brought in another 15,000 Sikh warriors. You add that all up, and you've got a combined force of 65,000 soldiers. This was a massive statement. The Jats were making it crystal clear that they were ready to take on the old imperial power head-on. But, it wasn't all about brute force. The Jats were also incredible builders with a really refined sense of culture and power. Just look at this description of their palace at Dig. It wasn't just some fort. It was an elaborate garden palace that very deliberately blended different royal architectural styles. And this is the key. This is so important. They were modeling their buildings on the grand styles of the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan, the guy who built the Taj Mahal. This was no accident. This was a political statement made with stone and marble. The Jats were basically telling the world, yeah, we see ourselves as the rightful heirs to the imperial legacy. So let's pull back and look at the big picture here. What do we see when we put these two incredible stories together? We see two very different, but equally effective blueprints for how to build power when an empire collapses. Each of them was forging a new era in their own unique image. This table really breaks it down nicely, right? You've got the Marathas, who were aiming to be the next big imperial power. They chose the path of widespread influence, creating this huge tribute network that boosted the economy, but also made them a lot of enemies. Then you have the Jats. They did the opposite. They focused on their heartland, building fortresses and creating a secure kingdom that became a beacon of prosperity and culture. Two completely different paths to power, two very distinct legacies. And that really leaves us with a final thought. A question that gets right to the heart of what these two groups were doing. Does true, lasting power come from spreading your influence as far and wide as possible, like the Marathas, or does it come from building a concentrated, secure, and totally unbreachable base, like the Jats? It's a question leaders have been wrestling with for centuries, and definitely one worth thinking about.